The radio crackled to life at 0300 hours. Staff Sergeant Michael Brennan, 5th Special Forces Group, reached for the handset in the operations room at Nui Dat, expecting another routine coordination request. What he heard instead would end his willingness to work with Australian forces for the remainder of his tour. The Australian SAS patrol leader voice came through crisp and composed, almost casual. They had eyes on a Viet Cong staging area. 15 confirmed enemy. Request for immediate artillery support denied. They would handle it themselves. 5 men against 15. Brennan tried to argue. The Australians cut the transmission. 6 hours later, they called for extraction. All 15 enemy eliminated. 0 Australian casualties. 0 shots heard beyond a 100-meter radius. And you know what the after-action report said? Americans make too much noise. We had to do it ourselves. Wait, the Australians said what? The guys who showed up in Vietnam with barely 150 operators total. The force so small they didn't even register on most American organizational charts. Those Australians had the nerve to call the most powerful military on Earth too loud, too stupid, too predictable to operate with. Oh, this story gets so much deeper than professional rivalry, because what unfolded in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy province between 1966 and 1971 was not just a clash of tactics, but a collision of military culture so fundamental that it would expose cracks in American doctrine that the Pentagon spent decades trying to ignore. You're about to discover why American Special Forces operators, men who had survived multiple tours and earned every combat decoration short of the Medal of Honor, started requesting transfers just to avoid joint operations with the Australians. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why one Green Beret captain submitted a report that got immediately classified at MACV headquarters. His assessment of Australian methods. They don't fight like soldiers, they hunt like animals. And they're better at it than we'll ever be. Stay with me. The 1st Australian SAS Squadron touched down at Vung Tau in June of 1966. 3rd Squadron, Special Air Service Regiment, consisted of 120 men rotating from their base in Perth, Western Australia. American liaison officers at the 1st Australian Task Force headquarters studied the unit roster with barely concealed skepticism. The Australians were bringing one squadron, one to fight in a war that had already consumed over 200,000 American troops with no end in sight. The American assessment was polite but dismissive. A nice gesture from an allied nation, a token force that would provide minimal combat capability while allowing Australia to claim it was supporting the war effort. The Australians could handle some basic reconnaissance work. Maybe run a few patrols in the safer areas around their base at New Dot. Stay out of the way while the real war was fought by real soldiers with real firepower. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong in ways that American military planners could never have anticipated. The problem began with assumptions. American Special Operations in Vietnam in 1966 operated according to doctrine refined through 2 world wars and Korea. Find the enemy. Fix them in position with superior firepower. Destroy them with overwhelming force. This methodology had crushed the Imperial Japanese Army across the Pacific. It had stopped the Chinese advance in Korea. It had won every conventional conflict America had fought for 20 years. But Vietnam was not a conventional conflict, and the Viet Cong were not a conventional enemy. They had spent years studying American tactics, learning to recognize the signatures of American operations from miles away. The distinctive thump of Huey helicopters announcing insertions. The radio chatter that filled the airwaves before, during, and after every mission. The predictable patrol patterns that followed terrain features and avoided difficult approaches against such an enemy. American methodology had a fatal flaw. You cannot destroy what you cannot catch, and you cannot catch an enemy who hears you coming from 5 kilometers away. The Australians operated under no such constraints. Their doctrine had been forged not in the massive industrial warfare of the world wars, but in the intimate violence of jungle counterinsurgency. The Malayan emergency from 1948 to 1960 had taught Australian forces that patience outweighed firepower. The Indonesian confrontation from 1963 to 1966 had refined those lessons into something approaching art. Small patrols, absolute silence, days or weeks in the bush without support, the willingness to spend 20 hours observing an enemy position before engaging, the understanding that the jungle itself could be a weapon more powerful than artillery if you learn to become part of it. These were not abstract principles. They were survival skills learned through trial and terrible error in terrain that killed the careless and rewarded the patient. And when 3rd Squadron arrived in Vietnam, they brought those skills with them. The first joint operation between American and Australian Special Forces occurred in July of 1966. Captain James Morrison, a MAC-Phi SOG liaison officer with 18 months in country and a Silver Star from previous operations, accompanied an Australian 5-man patrol into the northern approaches near Binba. Morrison had worked with Special Forces teams from 3 different groups, had trained with British SAS in Malaysia, considered himself reasonably knowledgeable about small unit operations. The Australian patrol departed at 0300 hours, moving on foot through 12 kilometres of mixed rubber plantation and jungle fringe. Morrison noted immediately that something was different. There was no talking, no hand signals, no sound whatsoever. The patrol leader, a lieutenant whose name Morrison never learned, communicated through touches. A hand on the shoulder meant stop. Pressure on the arm indicated direction. Signals so subtle Morrison missed half of them in the darkness. By dawn, they had established an observation position overlooking a trail intersection that intelligence suggested served as a courier route for D4 fortified Provincial Battalion. What Morrison witnessed over the next 18 hours would fundamentally alter his understanding of special operations warfare. The Australians did not set up a conventional ambush. They did not dig fighting positions or establish overlapping fields of fire. Instead, 4 men melted into the undergrowth on either side of the trail, while the 5th moved forward to examine the path itself. For 20 minutes, this soldier studied the trail, occasionally lowering his face to within centimeters of the ground, touching vegetation, sniffing the air. When he returned, he whispered something to the patrol leader that Morrison could not hear, despite being less than 2 meters away. The patrol leader nodded. The Australians repositioned with movement so slow it seemed almost geological. 11 hours later, 3 Viet Cong couriers walked directly into the kill zone. The engagement lasted 4 seconds. 3 enemy eliminated. 0 Australian casualties. 0 shots that could be heard beyond 50 meters. Morrison's after-action report noted the clinical efficiency of the ambush. But what disturbed him came after. Standard American doctrine called for immediate extraction, following enemy contact. Get in, hit hard, get out, before reinforcements arrived. The Australians remained in position for another 6 hours. At 30 hours, a 7-man Viet Cong search team arrived to investigate when the couriers failed to report. They found their comrades, arranged in a specific pattern Morrison would later describe as ritualistic. The 3 dead couriers had been positioned sitting upright against trees, their weapons placed across their laps as if resting. A playing card, the ace of spades, had been tucked into each man's collar. The psychological effect on the search team was immediate and visible. Even from 50 meters away, Morrison could see terror in their movements. 1 soldier vomited. Another fired blindly into the jungle, emptying his magazine at shadows. The Australians watched all of this without engaging, observing as the Viet Cong collected their dead and retreated at twice the speed they had arrived, abandoning all tactical discipline. Morrison concluded his classified report with an observation that would echo through intelligence assessments for years. Australian SAS does not conduct ambushes. They conduct psychological warfare operations using enemy bodies as the primary medium of communication. Effectiveness, unprecedented. Personal recommendation. I do not wish to participate in future joint operations. Morrison's report reached the desk of every senior Special Operations Commander in MACV. The responses divided along predictable lines. Some officers recognized the implications immediately if a five-man patrol could achieve results that required an American company to replicate. If psychological operations could degrade enemy effectiveness more efficiently than firepower, then perhaps American doctrine needed fundamental revision. Other officers reacted with barely concealed hostility. The Australian methods were described as unprofessional, borderline violations of the laws of war, incompatible with American military values. One colonel from 5th Special Forces Group submitted a counter-assessment arguing that such tactics might work for a tiny force operating in a limited area, but could never be scaled to the operational requirements of American forces in Vietnam. The debate never reached resolution because events overtook it. By September of 1966, 3rd Squadron had conducted 73 patrols throughout Phuoc Tuy Province. Their intelligence gathering had proven so valuable that 1st Australian Task Force headquarters began receiving requests from American commanders for Australian reconnaissance teams to operate in areas where American LRRP teams had failed to gather actionable intelligence. The requests were polite. The subtext was clear. Send your SAS where our long-range reconnaissance patrols cannot operate. The Australians agreed. What followed would cement their reputation and deepen the divide between Australian and American special operations methodology. In October, an Australian patrol inserted into the Em To Mountains, a Viet Cong stronghold that B-52 strikes had pounded for months without degrading enemy operations. The patrol consisted of 5 men. They carried rations for 14 days, minimal equipment, weapons selected for reliability over firepower. American observers at the helicopter insertion noted that the Australians looked more like bushwoo walkers than soldiers. Canvas sneakers instead of jungle boots, faded uniforms with no rank insignia, personal weapons that seemed almost antiquated compared to American kit. One operator carried a sword shotgun. Another had what appeared to be a World War II-era Owen submachine gun. The Americans watched the helicopter disappear into the mountains and gave the patrol 3 days before they'd be calling for emergency extraction. 14 days later, the patrol called for pickup. They brought with them intelligence that filled 70 pages of typed reports, detailed maps of Viet Cong tunnel networks, supply routes, cache locations, troop movements, information that American intelligence had been trying to acquire for 8 months. 0 contact with the enemy, 0 detection. The enemy never knew the Australians had been there. When American intelligence officers asked how they had achieved such results, the patrol leader's answer was blunt. We didn't announce our presence with helicopter noise and radio chatter. We walked in from 12 kilometers away. We moved like the jungle belonged to us. We made the enemy think they were safe. The American response was predictable. Such methods took too long, required too much patience, could not be replicated by conventional forces. The Australians shrugged. They had never claimed their methods could be scaled. They were showing what was possible when you abandoned the assumption that bigger was better. The tension between American and Australian approaches crystallized around a fundamental question. What was special operations supposed to achieve? American doctrine in 1966 emphasized decisive action, engage the enemy, destroy enemy forces, achieve measurable results that could be quantified in after-action reports. Body counts, weapons captured, terrain seized. Australian doctrine emphasized something entirely different. Dominate the enemy psychologically, make them afraid to patrol, make them question every shadow, make them believe the jungle itself had turned against them, achieve strategic effects through terror rather than attrition. These were not complementary philosophies. They were competing visions of warfare that could not coexist without friction. And as joint operations increased, that friction became impossible to ignore. Navy SEAL, Roger Hayden experienced this friction firsthand during a 10-day mission with Australian SIS in the Oman Forest during late 1967. Hayden, assigned to SEAL Team 1 with 2 previous tours and extensive reconnaissance experience, volunteered for the joint operation, partly out of curiosity. He had heard stories about Australian methods. He wanted to see if the reputation was deserved. The patrol lasted 10 days. During that entire period, the Australians did not speak a single word. Communication occurred through hand and arm signals, so subtle Hayden admitted he missed most of them. Movement through the jungle was so slow, so deliberate, that hours would pass, covering distances an American patrol would traverse in minutes. But the results were undeniable. The Australians located 3 Viet Cong-based camps, mapped supply routes, observed enemy movements from positions so close Hayden could smell the cooking fires, all without detection, all without firing a shot. When Hayden returned to his unit, he submitted a report that would be cited in sealed training materials for decades. In underwater demolition teams, you just don't have the fieldcraft to be out in the jungle looking for people. Australian fieldcraft was so good, you had to have your act together. According to Hayden, SEALs lost a lot of men because of lack of fieldcraft preparation. The Australians had something American Special Operations lacked. Not better equipment, not superior firepower, something more fundamental. An understanding that the jungle was not the enemy's weapon, but could be yours if you were willing to become something other than a conventional soldier. But Hayden's positive assessment was not universal. Other American special operators who worked with Australians came away disturbed by what they witnessed. The methods were effective, yes, but they crossed lines that American military culture was not prepared to cross. Staff Sergeant David Walsh, assigned to 5th Special Forces Group, participated in a joint operation with 2nd Squadron SAS in the Long High Hills during March of 1968. The mission brief was straightforward: locate and observe Viet Cong positions, gather intelligence, avoid contact if possible. The Australian patrol leader, a captain whose name Walsh never recorded, laid out different rules. If we make contact, we finish it. No prisoners, no survivors, no evidence we were here except bodies arranged to send a message. Walsh's objection was immediate. American rules of engagement required accepting enemy surrender, treating prisoners according to Geneva Conventions, conducting operations within legal and moral constraints. The Australian captain listened politely, then explained that those constraints got soldiers killed in jungles, where the enemy showed no such restraint. The patrol would operate according to Australian methods, or the Americans could stay behind. Walsh went along. What he witnessed over the next 6 days would haunt him for decades. The patrol located a Viet Cong sentry position on the 3rd night. 2 soldiers manning an observation post overlooking a supply trail. Standard American doctrine would have been to observe, document radio intelligence back to headquarters. The Australians had different ideas. The patrol leader sent 2 men forward. They moved through darkness with such silence that Walsh, watching from 20 meters away, could not hear them approach the enemy position. The sentries never raised an alarm. The 2 Australians returned 15 minutes later. The patrol leader used hand signals to indicate they were moving out. Walsh asked what happened to the sentries. The Australian response was delivered in a whisper so cold it made Walsh's blood freeze. Sentries are sleeping permanently, they won't wake up, and their friends will find them in the morning. Arranged in a way that will make them think twice about accepting sentry duty in this area again. Walsh's after-action report, submitted through classified channels, concluded with a personal assessment that perfectly captured the divide between Australian and American special operations culture. The Australians are the most effective operators I have ever worked with. They are also the most disturbing. They do not see themselves as soldiers conducting military operations. They see themselves as hunters. And in hunting, there is no such thing as a fair fight. By mid-1968, the pattern had become clear. Australian SAS was achieving results that American special operations could not match. not because of superior equipment or training, but because of fundamental differences in operational philosophy. Where Americans announced their presence with helicopter insertions, the Australians walked in from kilometers away. Where Americans relied on radio communications, the Australians maintained absolute noise discipline. Where Americans sought decisive engagements, the Australians emphasized patience and psychological dominance. The kill ratio told the story. Australian SAS in Vietnam achieved ratios exceeding 30-1 by some estimates. American MACV average kill ratio hovered around 7-1. Conventional infantry averaged approximately 1-1. These numbers were not classified secrets. They were documented facts that every intelligence officer could access, and they raised an uncomfortable question that American military leadership could not easily answer. If a force of 150 Australians could achieve better results than American battalions 10 times their size, what did that say about American doctrine? The Pentagon's response was telling. Rather than acknowledge the implications, senior commanders focused on explaining why Australian methods could not work for American forces. The Australians operated in a single province with clear boundaries. Americans had responsibility for the entire country. Australian patrols could spend weeks in the field without support. American operations required coordination with larger units. Australian methods emphasized stealth and patience. American doctrine required decisive action and measurable results. These were not wrong observations. They were rationalizations designed to protect institutional assumptions from uncomfortable truths. The real reason American forces could not adopt Australian methods had nothing to do with operational requirements and everything to do with organizational culture. American military institutions in 1968 were designed for conventional warfare scaled to industrial dimensions. Thousands of soldiers, supported by overwhelming firepower, achieving objectives through mass and momentum. The entire structure of command, logistics, training, and doctrine assumed this model. Special operations existed as specialized tools within this framework, but they still operated according to fundamentally conventional assumptions. Find, fix, destroy, measure success in quantifiable terms, maintain command and control through radio networks. The Australians rejected these assumptions entirely. They treated special operations not as specialized conventional warfare, but as an entirely different category of conflict requiring entirely different mindsets. The cultural divide manifested in countless small ways that accumulated into fundamental incompatibility. American helicopter pilots complained that Australian insertion requests were needlessly complicated. The Australians wanted multiple false insertions, wanted helicopters to touch down in locations where patrols would not actually dismount, wanted flight patterns designed to confuse enemy observers. American pilots, trained to maximize efficiency and minimize exposure to ground fire, saw these requests as paranoid overcomplications. Australian patrol leaders trained to assume the enemy was always watching, saw American efficiency as suicidal predictability. American intelligence officers grew frustrated with Australian reporting. The Australians would spend 2 weeks gathering intelligence and return with detailed observations, but no quantifiable results, no body count, no weapons captured, no infrastructure destroyed, just pages of notes about enemy patterns, behaviors, psychological states. American intelligence wanted hard data that could feed into operations planning. Australian intelligence provided subtle observations about enemy morale and habits that could not be easily quantified, but proved devastatingly effective when properly utilized. American logisticians struggled with Australian supply requests. The Australians wanted minimal resupply, often operating for weeks on rations that American quartermasters considered inadequate. They modified equipment in ways that violated American procedures, cut the soles from their boots to reduce noise and alter their footprint signature, removed rank insignia and unit patches from uniforms, carried weapons selected for reliability over standardization. From an American institutional perspective, these modifications represented lack of discipline and disregard for proper procedures. From an Australian perspective, institutional procedures that prioritized uniformity over effectiveness were exactly what got soldiers killed in environments where adaptation meant survival. But the deepest source of tension was not tactical or logistical. It was moral. Australian psychological operations crossed lines that American military culture in 1968 was not prepared to cross. The body display doctrine had no official name in Australian military documentation. It existed in classified annexes of after-action reports, in whispered conversations among men who had witnessed it, in the nightmares of Viet Cong, soldiers who survived encounters with what they called Maung, the jungle ghosts. The principle was elegant and disturbing. Every engagement with the enemy was an opportunity for communication. Not communication with headquarters, communication with the enemy themselves. And the most powerful message that could be sent was one that exploited the deepest fears of Vietnamese peasant soldiers raised on folk tales of forest spirits and vengeful ghosts. Australian SAS operators did not simply kill enemy soldiers. They staged their deaths, bodies positioned to suggest supernatural intervention. Weapons arranged to indicate the victim had seen something terrible in final moments. Playing cards, the ace of spades, which Vietnamese superstition associated with death omens, left as calling cards. In some cases, operators infiltrated enemy positions at night and left signs of their presence without engaging, footprints that appeared from nowhere and led to nothing, equipment rearranged while guards slept, messages scratched into tree bark. The effect on Viet Cong morale was measurable and devastating. Political officers reported increasing difficulty maintaining unit cohesion in areas where Australian SAS operated. Desertion rates spiked. Soldiers refused night patrol assignments. Some units began conducting elaborate spiritual rituals before entering zones where the phantoms were known to operate. Captured documents from D-Form 45 Battalion revealed an organization descending into collective paranoia. Entry from November 3, 1968. 3 comrades failed to return from water collection. Search found no bodies, no blood, no evidence of contact. Political officer suspects desertion. Commander believes otherwise. Entry from November 7th. Sentry Position 4. Reported presence in jungle at 0200 hours.